Pretty much every single card game out there is going to have their fair share of random effects. In games like Hearthstone, they're all over the place, and in games like Pokemon, some of the best cards ever printed actually have these coin flip effects attached to them. However, in Yu-Gi-Oh, that's not so much the case, and in today's video, we're going to go through why coin flip cards failed horribly. Now, what I like to do at the start of all of these types of videos is briefly talk about the coin flip effects that actually did see some competitive use, because I don't just want to ignore them entirely. So the biggest one that I think of is the Paths of Destiny. Now this card isn't super great, but it is pretty good in a Nurseburn deck, especially before Nurseburn got all the recent Dark Lord support. This card is a near staple, mainly because you would use it when you have Nurse Rificule on the board, and then no matter what the result, your opponent would take the 2,000 points of damage, and that's pretty darn good. However, it is kind of interesting that one of the reasons this card is played is because it's played in a deck that ignores the coin flip, but nevertheless it still is a coin flip card seeing play. A card like Fiend Comedian actually falls into one of the categories that I'm going to talk about a little later on, or at least it did for many years, but actually this card has seen some side deck use, mainly because when this card was designed, the drawback of milling all of your cards, or a lot of them, was a real drawback. However, eventually when Lightsworns came into circulation, a lot of people were actually playing Fiend Comedian, because when you play Lightsworns or any deck that wants to mill a lot of cards, it basically once again nullifies the coin flip, because if you hit heads, that's really good, but if you hit tails, it doesn't really matter as well. Well, I guess in this one's case, it's just calling it right. It's not necessarily heads or tails, but regardless, the reason that this one saw play very similar to the Paths of Destiny is because once again, you would play it in a deck where the coin flip itself didn't matter too much. And the last card that saw play that has a coin flip mechanic is Arcana Force Zero, the Fool. Now, what's interesting about this is that once again, this card was not played for the coin flip effect, and in fact, most of the times that you were playing this card, you were actually just setting it face down. It might seem crazy, but back in the day, especially when this card came out, there wasn't as much spot removal as there is in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot of people were playing Spirit Reaper, a card that saw play pretty much right up until 2012, but people really wanted to try out Arcana Force the Fool as well, because while it didn't have the attacking directly effect of Spirit Reaper, where you could discard a card from your opponent's hand, it did not have the sort of drawback effect of Spirit Reaper, where it just blew up if it was targeted, meaning that Arcana Force the Fool was actually kind of a middle ground for a lot of players, and it was particularly good in the Dino Rabbit matchup because they didn't have lots of outs to it. Anyway, that is pretty much the only 3 coin flip cards that saw competitive use. Now let's go through why this mechanic failed entirely, and also the different directions that it took throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! What's interesting is that I actually feel that old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards with the coin flip mechanic got it correct a lot of times compared to the new school cards. And what I mean by that is that if we take a look at that giant spider card from 2002 back in Metal Raiders, it had a lot of good stats on it. 2200 attack on a 4-star monster was insane, and then its effect was when this declares an attack, you toss a coin and call it. If you call it wrong, lose half your life points. So why do I like this card compared to a lot of the newer cards? Well, I like this card because even if you call it wrong, you still have a 2200 attack monster, and if you call it right, well then you have a 2200 attack monster that has no drawback. And I think that's really cool, because in Yu-Gi-Oh! You can't just attack directly around your opponent's monsters. So even if you didn't want to attack with this thing, you could just normal summon it and your opponent would be forced to deal with a 2200 attack monster, which I think is really cool. And what I also think is cool is cards like Sasuke Samurai number 4 and Fairy Box, cards where once again, if you call the coin toss correctly, you have a huge upside, but the card isn't completely useless if you don't call it correctly. It doesn't like blow up, it doesn't inflict damage to yourself, it doesn't do anything like that. And I think that's how coin flip cards should be designed, and we'll look at some newer cards later on as well. But I think I really do want to shout out Konami for creating these sort of good coin flip cards way back in the day. Maybe their effects weren't quite powerful enough to actually see competitive use, but I think from a design standpoint, this is how coin flip cards should be. They should have upsides for calling the coin right, but they shouldn't completely screw you over if you call it wrong. Obviously, you should be incentivized to call it correctly, but if you call it wrong, you shouldn't just lose the game immediately. And even in the case of the spider monster, which has the biggest drawback, I don't think that drawback is necessarily too crazy. You still get to keep your monster, which is pretty darn important. And a lot of these cards, they're not just self-destructing if you call it wrong. They actually just have better effects as long as you call the coin toss correctly, which is how I think these cards should be made just going forward in general. When I really think of why people aren't playing coin flip cards, I think it pretty much falls into one of two reasons, if not both. Now, they're not the same thing. They might sound the same, but I'll explain what I mean. So the first reason a lot of people do not play coin flip cards is because the benefit of getting the coin toss correct isn't high enough to actually warrant the coin flip. And the second reason is that the downside of the card is simply way too scary to even try to flip a coin. Now, how are these two things different? Well, when I think of the first case where there are cards where the upside just is not good enough, I think of pretty much all of the mid-leveled Arcana Force monsters, where if you can look at a card and ask yourself, if this card didn't have a coin flip effect and just had the good effect on it, would it still be played, or would it potentially see play? And in almost all the cases, the answer is still no. Now, that's not necessarily bad. Not every card has to be broken, but then when you attach a potentially really negative effect on these cards that already aren't that great, even when they have their good effects, well, that's going to create some problems because people just want more consistent cards. They just want cards that they know will always be good, as opposed to cards that will sometimes be okay. And that's the case for many of the coin flip cards. And once again, I think the Arcana Force monsters specifically are the best example of this, because pretty much all of these Arcana Force mid-level monsters, maybe not so much the higher level ones, but the ones from like 2 to 5, all of them have these sort of okay-ish effects when you call heads, but their tails effect is just needlessly discouraging to someone that's actually trying to play Arcana Force, which means, yeah, of course, even someone that's a fan of the deck, they might not have that much fun playing it when they realize that even if they hit heads on every single coin flip, their deck still wouldn't be that good, and that's not something that I really like. If we look at those older cards, if you call the coin toss correctly every single time, you are actually rewarded pretty heavily, unlike the Arcana Force archetype. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the cards where the drawback of missing the coin toss actually hurts you so much that it doesn't even really matter how good the upside is. One example of this is the Gambler of Legend card back from Gladiator's Assault. This card has 4 possible results. You're actually tossing 3 different coins, and some of them are okay. Obviously, if you get 3 heads, that's really good. It's a Regeki effect. 2 heads is okay. It discards a card from your opponent's hand, but the 1 head and the 3 tails results, which you're going to get half the time, are absolutely horrible. I mean, one of them, you're popping a card you control, and then if you somehow manage to get 3 tails, which knowing my luck would happen more often than not, you discard your entire hand. And that basically means is that even though the 3 heads and the 2 heads results are pretty good, and even really good in the case of 3 heads, that does not make up for how bad the 1 head and the 3 tails result is, which means that playing this card is way too much of a, I mean, pardon the pun, but it's way too much of a gamble if you're trying to play a competitive strategy or even a rogue strategy. It's not fun to miss coin tosses and discard your entire hand. And yeah, I'm sure someone will say, well, you could just play this card in Dark Worlds and trigger those effects. Even in that case, you might as well just play cards that you consistently know are going to discard specific cards from your hand, instead of just playing something that every once in a while will do that. And I think another really good and probably the most well-known example of this is Cup of Ace, a card that if you get the right coin toss, you actually just have a pot of greed. That's not, you can play 3 of them. However, the downside of giving your opponent 2 cards is actually way too ridiculous to ever consider this card in competitive play, because Cup of Ace in that case, if you actually miss the coin toss, is a -3. You are losing a card and you're giving your opponent 2 cards cards for nothing, that sort of -3 outweighs the potential +1 that it can have. Now, maybe if this card said you draw 3 cards if you get it right, maybe that would make it a little more competitive, but even in that case, you're talking about, once again, you getting a +2, but if you miss, your opponent gets a +3, which is absolutely ridiculous. So a card like Cup of Ace really does show that no matter how good the upside is of a coin toss card, if the downside of it, if the missed call of it is so bad that you can't play the card, well then no one is actually going to try to play it in a competitive strategy. Now I do want to mention, I'm pretty sure Cup of Ace actually did see play in Duel Links, but that format is kind of completely different from the TCG, so I didn't really want to compare it when I'm analyzing this card, but I am pretty sure that some cheese strategies in Duel Links actually do play this card. Now it's worth mentioning that in Duel Links, because there aren't as high as stakes, because you're not actually traveling to go to a tournament with Cup of Ace. If you lose the game, well, nothing really happens, you can just start a new game over, whereas if you went to a 2 hours to a regional qualifier and played Cup of Ace, well yeah, you're going to be pretty pissed when the card actually misses. Lastly, I want to address the future of the coin flip mechanic and kind of mention a card that recently came out this year, actually at the start of 2018, and that is Desperado Barrel Dragon. Now when this card came out, as well as a couple other coin flip cards, I actually was pretty excited for the deck, and I played it a couple times on stream. Now the reason that I like this card is that it actually has pretty decent effects even if you don't hit all of your coin flips perfectly. It has a free special summon effect, it has a graveyard effect, it has all sorts of cool effects, but also it has this sort of coin flip mechanic built in where when it's summoned, or I guess, sorry, not when it's summoned, once returned during the battle phase, you get to toss a coin 3 times and then you get to destroy cards on the field up to the number of heads, and that's really cool just by itself, because if you get 3 tails, nothing bad happens. But what's really cool about this is that if you hit 1 head or 2 heads, you're destroying 1 or 2 cards. That's pretty neat. But then if you hit all 3 heads, if you do get really lucky, you actually get to draw 1 card on top of that. And I think this is going back to the roots of how coin flip cards should be designed. This card is good by itself, and actually if the other coin flip support from the set was better, I'm pretty sure this deck would have been a good rogue strategy. The problem was that this was like the best card that they had, and it wasn't really that searchable, which kind of created this issue. But if all the coin flip cards released in that set were as good as Desperado Barrel Dragon, I believe it would have been a pretty decent rogue deck, because this card is just well designed, and it does what those old coin flip cards do, where they don't punish you for missing the coin flip, they just reward you for hitting it. And I think that's really cool, and I hope Konami actually tries putting that on to future coin flip cards, although I'm not sure if they're going to print too many of them heading forward, because it seems the general community just doesn't like to play them. Anyway, that is going to wrap up today's discussion. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you enjoyed sort of walking through the history of coin flip cards, where they've succeeded, where they haven't succeeded, and also where they're going. Let me know what you guys think about this video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.